For as long as Ninjago has existed, the age-old question has always been, how old are the ninja? And ultimately, a lot of people have had their own take on it, and a lot of people have had their own interpretation on it, but I personally have never been fully content with the answers that we've had. So I decided to sit down and come up with my own interpretation on how the ninja are aged throughout the course of the show. And ultimately, you can agree with me, you can disagree with me, and that is the freedom of opinion. But I have personally tried to use logic and reasoning and small details from the show to kind of pick up where the ninja are depending on the time of the show. And here is my basis for the most part. Per season, I am taking any evidence that I can and I am basing it off of that. Any sort of reference to time frame, any sort of reference to what they're doing or what they're saying, I'm taking it at face value, and I'm going to be filling in the gaps accordingly because of that. Because there are slight little subtle details that I have picked up on from certain seasons that certainly helps with that factor. There's also a couple details that I found throughout the show that I'm going to be using in accordance with the cultures that Ninjago is based off of. Of course, for the most part, Ninjago is based off of Chinese and Japanese culture, and there are certain ages where you're allowed to do things and certain ages you're allowed to not do things. So I'm also taking that into consideration because there is a scene in particular that also helps out my cause. But that's what I'm using as my basis, and I'm going to be honest, for the most part I am actually quite happy with it, because the ages I have come to is actually one I'm quite content with, and honestly makes the most sense. So, let me not waste any more of your time, and let's see how old the ninja are throughout the course of the show. Now, of course, we have the core 6. I'm going to cover Aaron and Sora very briefly at the end, but I'm only really covering the core 6 that we see from the start to the very end. And of course, there are certain little details that you can pick up on that kind of gives you an idea on what their ages are. Zane pre-Titanium is of course the oldest, and post-Titanium is a whole different thing that I'll get into at some point, but Zane at first is typically the oldest. But then in terms of humans, Cole is also typically considered the oldest of the bunch. He's more leader, he's more authoritative, he's also more fatherly, so Cole for the most part is considered the oldest of the bunch. I also consider Kai the same age as Cole, mostly because of how they interact with each other. It's a very best friend kind of dynamic, especially later on in the show, so for the most part I do consider Kai to be the same age as Cole. I consider Jay then 1 year younger, and that's mostly down to the fact that him and Kai have more of like an older younger brother relationship. I do think there's a lot of details that imply that kind of dynamic between them. And ultimately, I do think Jay needs to be a little bit younger than Kai, so he matches more up with Nia. So, Jay typically I considered a year younger. Nia then I consider 1 year below again, which would make her 2 years younger than Kai, which for the most part for me anyway does line up with what we get to know about the two. So Nia typically is 2 years younger than Kai and Cole and a year younger than Jay. So it's a quite steady dynamic because of that. And then last but not least is of course Lloyd, which of course is a much younger initially, but once he's aged up he is still remarked to be the youngest of the group, mainly Harumi in season 8. She says outright that Lloyd is the youngest, and of course she very much studied up on the ninja. So I consider Lloyd in his aged up variant to be 1 year younger than Nia, which again makes sense because Nia acts a lot like an older sister to him. So for the most part that's the dynamic I've got going. Now, of course, I'm going to start off with the pilots themselves. I will say, I have no evidence to suggest the ninja's age in the pilots. The first one for me actually does come from Rebooted. But I will say, I'm going to give that evidence, and I'll tell you where the basis of everything came from as I get to it, because otherwise it won't make much sense. But spoiler alert, my main basis was Season 3, Season 9, and Crystallized. So, let's go from there. Anyways, in the pilots, the ninja are still quite young, they're quite inexperienced, they do almost act a little more childlike, so I do consider them to be not exactly young, but young at the same time. I consider them to be almost early teen. So, for Kai and Cole, I initially set them out at 15. I set out Jay at 14. Zane is about 35, because we know obviously he's had a couple decades with Dr. Julian, but it's never really outright confirmed. We get to see Dr. Julian throughout his life, but we don't get an outright confirmation to when he actually starts. And I don't really agree with the idea that he made Zane when he was like 18. That doesn't really make much sense. I consider him to be about 30-40 when he made Zane, so he's about 35 in my opinion, so that's where Zane is initially. Nia's going to be 13 because of that, and Lloyd, who obviously wasn't in the pilots but still is a factor, he is about 8 at that point. You then do get to season 1, and I don't think there's too much of a passage of time between the pilot and the first season, but there has to be enough time for the ninja to get a little bit complacent. There has to be enough time for Garmadon to be able to power up. There's a couple different factors that definitely does come into it, but I do think for the most part, between the pilot and the first season, the ninja definitely do age up. You can see that they still have the level of immaturity that they have in the pilot. You can see that they still have those really weird tendencies, and I do think ultimately speaking, the ninja are just simply a little bit older, but not too much at the exact same time. So Kai and Cole are 16, Jay is 15, Zane is 36, and Lloyd is 9, and of course Nia is also 14. So even though they're not too much older, they're a little more competent, which also does come with age. I do think there's some little subtle details that shows that they are at least a little bit more than they were in the actual pilots themselves. So that, in my opinion, implies that they did age up. After that then was of course season 2, and season 2 happens literally when season 1 finishes. So there is no passage of time, there is no outright difference in age apart from Lloyd. So Kai and Cole remain 16, Jay is also 15, Zane's still 36, Nia is 14, and Lloyd goes from 9 to 13. And I do think that makes the most sense. I think the initial confrontation with the Overlord, him being about 13, honestly makes sense, all things considered. I do think it's a bit weird to consider him 13 at that point, but at the same time he can't be that old, and there is reason why later on. So 13 sounds about right for Lloyd. I do think that's a nice age to have him for that point. Then came Rebooted, and I do think there was a passage of time between season 2 and season 3, and you'll see why in a minute as well, but I definitely think there was a change in the actual age of the ninja at that point. And like I said, season 3 is one of the seasons where I actually have a basis for it, and that actually comes from Kai. In the episode of season 3 where we get to see Kai with the X1 Ninja Charger, we get to see the team actually contact him to intercept a Ninjoid convoy. But at that point in time, Kai is actually at a petrol station, and when he is there, he is talking with a woman who is presumably working at the petrol station. It's an interesting detail to note because Kai is actively flirting with someone who is working or of a working age. Now, assuming Kai isn't just breaking the law and he's just not flirting with someone when he shouldn't really be, I do like to think that Kai at that point in time would be able to be of an age where he is able to flirt with women who are in the actual workforce. And if you do look up the working age in Eastern culture, it is typically considered to be around the 16 age mark. So, of course, we do understand that the ninja was 16 as of season 2, and it's relatively new to Kai, and I do think that's another big factor. But of course, that does imply that Kai is of a legal age to be able to talk to women or flirt with women who are also of age. So this implies to me that Kai at the very least had to be 16 years old at that point. But all things considered, and taking in the different aspects to account, and taking the ages going backwards, it made more sense for Kai to be around the 17 mark by this point in time. And that is literally backed up by the fact that he was flirting with a woman, yes. But with that logic, we can assume that Kai by this point is 17. So that also makes Cole 17, Jay 16, Zane 37, Lloyd 14, and Nia 15. And like I said, that was my initial bouncing point. So I like to think this is possibly one of the more accurate places you could put them by this point. But after that then came season 4, and I do think it was a relatively busy year for the ninja at this point, and I will explain why. Because I don't think they aged up between season 3 and season 4. Of course, we have to assume that they didn't go without Zane for too long. Of course, the ninja have other careers, but that wouldn't have taken too long either. But the fact is that they didn't really get a lot of time to process things. There's still a lot of loose threads, there's still a lot of interesting implications, and I don't think Chen would have held on to Zane for that long, or Zane wouldn't have been able to go away for that long either. And all the dialogue with Zane does imply that he is quite newly built, so there can't be too long between season 3 and season 4, so everyone is the same age. Kai 17, Cole 17, Jay 16, Lloyd 14, Nia 15, and Zane is officially 0. Season 5 also presumably takes place basically just after season 4, because more was released and he presumably just got straight to it. I doubt he would have really been lingering for too long. So again, I do think this also happened within the same year. So Kai and Cole 17, Jay 16, Lloyd 14, Nia 15, and Zane 0. And again, to sound like a broken record, Season 6 also has to take place within that same year, because Styx is still destroyed, there is still consequences of Styx, and there is still a lot of interest and implications because of it. Of course, the other big detail being that Klaus was spotted, obviously roaming as a ghost, and I doubt he would have gone too long with being in a ghost form without being spotted. So ultimately, Season 6 has to take place quite quickly afterwards as well. So, by that definition, I do believe, by that account, they are still the same ages. Kai and Cole 17, Jay 16, Zane 0, Lloyd 14, Nia 15. But that's where that year for the Ninja actually ends. I do think Season 3 to Season 6 all happening within the same year does ultimately make sense. I do think in the grand scheme of things, they all kind of have to take place within proximity of each other based on the events, how the ninja are acting, and all those different aspects. And all the ages that I've listed off for this year also make sense. I mean, Lloyd being 14 and facing with losing his father, he has a very understandable reaction for his age, and all the other ninja, how they act with each other and everything around them. It all kind of just makes sense to be in that general teenage phase. So I do think for the most part, that is kind of the best age for them. After that though did come Day of the Departed, and I do think for the most part it does make sense for a year or at least the ninja to have aged up in this time. There seems to be a bit of a disconnect between these two seasons in terms of what they know. For example, Cole's gone from being a perfectly fine ghost to disappearing, and they act like he's disappearing again. So the fact is that there has to be some sort of period of time. Also, Nia now knows Spinjitzu, so of course she had to have time to train. I do think there's a lot of different aspects that shows that the passage of time has definitely occurred here. So that, by all account, would make Kai and Cole 18, Jay 17, Zane 1, Lloyd 15, and Nia 16, which, for the most part, again, does make sense to me. And then in the same age would also then be Season 7, because we get to see, of course, at the very start of Season 7, them clean up all of the villain mannequins after Day of the Departed. So, by all account, Day of the Departed seemed to have happened basically the day or two before Season 7 actually begins. So, by that definition, the ninja have to be the same age. So, Kai and Cole 18, Jay 17, Zane 1, Lloyd 15, and Nia is 16. But for the classic era of Ninjago, I do believe that's their ages. It does make sense for them to be in that phase of early to late teen and approaching adulthood, and how they act and how they behave is definitely consistent with that fact. But let's carry on to the next phase, which is the Oni trilogy. Now, the Oni trilogy, for the most part, in my opinion, does all take place within the same year. I mean, Season 8 is remarked at taking place a year after Season 7, so we know for a fact that the ninja have definitely aged up at least one by this point. But for Season 8 and Season 9, they take place one after the other, and I do believe Season 10 probably was like a couple months after. I don't think there was too long between the two. The main thing is that there needed to be enough time to rebuild the monastery, but I do think for the most part the Oni trilogy was all within the place of 1 year itself. So that would make Kai and Cole 19, that would make Jay 18, Zane 2, Lloyd 16, and Nia 17. And again, this age does make sense because, like I said, Season 9 is the other basing point for this video, where of course in Season 9 we get a scene where Kai remarks to Jay that they are in fact still teenagers, and in my opinion, the interesting aspect of that sentence is still. Now, typically speaking in the real world, the concept of still teenagers does come around the point of 18 and 19, because you're out of the typical teenager kind of age group, but at the same time, you are still by definition a teenager. So, I do think Kai specifying that they are still teenagers implies the idea that they are in fact of age. They are technically adults, but they are still within the one starting digit bracket. So I do think Kai, Jay, and Cole in particular being the 18-19 zone makes the most sense. And like I said, it does just make sense then for the Oni trilogy to all take place within the same year. I do think it was a relatively hectic year and a relatively traumatizing year. I mean, Lloyd also being traumatized at the age of 16 makes a little too much sense in my opinion. But yeah, I think these ages make sense. Let's move on to the Wild Brain era. Now, personally speaking, I don't think the Wild Brain era takes place in the same year as the Oni trilogy. We know there's been a couple of months between the two because Wu remarks that fact. So I do think within that time, it was probably a new year and a new age for all the ninja. So, Kai Cole is 20, Jay is 19, Zane is 3, Lloyd is 17, and Nia is 18. And again, these ages kind of just make sense to me. It makes sense because they're still much more competent in their fighting skills, they're taking on more of their own look and their own identity, and you can see that reflected in their suits. You can see them act a little more mature as well. Of course, there's still instances of immaturity, but that kind of still comes with the age. But the fact is that I do think for the most part, these ages do fit in with how they're behaving at the time. But I do think in similar vein to Season 3 through Season 6 where they had a hectic year, I do think for the most part the Wild Brain era did actually take place within the same year. And there's not really much evidence to back this up, apart from the fact that we do get a scene in Crystallized where Kai remarks that basically one thing was happening after another. I mean, we get to see Kai remark, oh well, we went to the Netherrealm, and then we were in a game, and then we were in a mountain. He acts like they were all happening basically one after the other. So by that account, I do believe most of the Wild Brain era was all within the same year. Specifically up to the point of Seabound though, because of course we know Crystallized there is a year gap. But for Season 12, 13, The Island, and 14, I do think for the most part they did stay the same age. So Kai and Cole being 20, Jay being 19, Zane being 3, Lloyd being 17, and Nia being 18. The only thing I haven't done for this section is, of course, the time that Zane spent as the Ice Emperor. Of course, you could account for the fact that Zane did spend 60 years as the Ice Emperor himself, but I haven't included it during this because, for one, we haven't got an outright confirmed passage of time for Zane at this point, and also, considering that Zane doesn't really seem to remember his time as the Ice Emperor, I do think it's a weird space of time to consider. But as a base point, you could just simply add 60 onto this point on for Zane. But simply put, I really didn't, and ultimately speaking, I just didn't really want to consider that space of time because it's very much ambiguous to put it lightly. But if you do want to consider the Ice Emperor, just add about 60 years from this point onwards. And also, please don't rinse me in the comments. But then, like I said, Crystallize is 1 year later, and I'm going to be honest, again, in a really weird sense, these ages make so much sense to me again, because for the final battle, the final force of darkness, the final confrontation between light, dark, creation, destruction, these ages are a bit too coincidental for me. And that being Kai and Cole 21, Jay 20, Zane 4, Nia 19, and Lloyd 18. The fact that Lloyd's initial confrontation with the Overlord being 13 and his second one being 18, I think is almost perfect. And I'm going to be honest, I think what makes the most sense to me. But that is the Wild Brain era, and I do think, like I said, for the most part, they were relatively the same age. But we do then get to go into Dragon's Rising, which there is an interesting aspect to consider. In Dragon's Rising, we get told that there was a couple years between Season 1 Part 1 and the merge itself. So, the common consensus is that there is about 5 years. And honestly, I do agree with that for the most part. But the thing is, I also believe that there wasn't much time between the ending of Crystallize and the merge itself. Only probably a couple of months, which means they would be the same age as Crystallize as when the merge occurred. This would mean 5 years later, in Season 1 Part 1 of Dragon's Rising, we get to see Kai and Cole be 26, we get to see Jay 25, we get to see Zane being 9, Lloyd being 23, and Nia being 24. And again, I do think these ages make sense for the most part. Of course, we get to see Lloyd being romanticized by Aaron as being Master Lloyd, and Lloyd being in his early 20s probably wouldn't consider himself a master. He's probably more matured, more mellow, more down to earth, but I do think for the most part, it makes sense for Lloyd about that age to deny the fact that he is a master. But then, of course, Season 1 Part 2 takes place basically straight after, so they would maintain the same ages. Like I said, Kai Cole 26, Jay 25, Zane 9, Lloyd 23, and Nia 24. And that makes sense for the most part, but it's what comes after that that's the issue. There is a short series called What the Mech that takes place between Season 1 and Season 2 of Dragon's Rising, and they remark about the Crossroads Carnival. But the fact is that we also know that that carnival only takes place once every year, and they're going to it again this time round, which means a year has passed between Season 1 and Season 2. Which means we're going to have to age the ninja up again. And I'm gonna be honest, this also just opens up a lot of interesting questions, like Raz and Jordana just not doing anything for the course of a year, but that's honestly just another issue in of itself, and I'm gonna ignore it for the most part and just take the evidence at face value. So, as of what the mech, Kai and Cole are 27, Jay's 26, Zayn is 10, Lloyd's 24, and Nia is 25. But that then does bring us to Season 2, Part 1, and I will say, I do think that this does take place basically just after What the Mech. I don't think there's much time because the ninjas still have the same suits, they still have the same mechs, they still have the same technology, there is not much different. And Season 2 Part 2 basically takes place just after as well, so I don't think there's much time there. And Season 3 Part 1 also takes place basically just after, because obviously all the different aspects that we get to establish. The Forbidden Five wouldn't have waited, Aaron and Raz wouldn't have just been hanging about doing nothing, they wouldn't have just stopped their search for Jay once again, which means for the most part, the end of the show, or the most recent era of the show, Dragon's Rising Season 3, it is them at the same age as What the Mech. So, let's kind of conclude this off. To conclude, as of Dragon's Rising Season 3 Part 1, I do believe that the ages of the ninja sit Kai 27, Cole 27, Jay 26, Zayn 10, Lloyd 24, and Nia 25. I do think them all being in their mid-20s makes the most sense, and I do think this timeline of age ultimately does make more sense in the grand scheme of things. There's of course different aspects you can consider, and I'm gonna be honest, I do think it overcomplicates things a bit too much. Like, did Cole age as a ghost? Did Nia age when she was in her aqueous form? Did Jay or Zayn, for example, age depending on where they were found post-merge? There is a lot of different aspects you can consider, but ultimately speaking, it would make this video a bit too hard to comprehend. So I'm sticking with the idea that they remain consistent in their age, and that is the overall graph that I'm going to have. But this is the graph I use. It is an absolute mess. I did it at 2 AM. This is my interpretation of their ages. If you think there's anything that you don't agree with, please point it out to me in the comment section down below. But in my opinion, taking all the references that we have gotten, taking the time frames, taking the subtle details that we've also taken from the show, I do believe this is the most comprehensive version of the ninjas' ages throughout the course of the show. And honestly, them starting out at about 15 or 14 and ended off in their late 20s as of current, I do think ultimately makes the most sense. But what do you guys think? Oh, and to add it on at the end, I will also say Aaron and Sora, I do think at the point of the merge they're around the age of 10, which honestly kind of just makes the most sense. Which means in Season 1 of Dragon's Rising, they're about the 15 mark, and as of current, they're about 16, which I do think ultimately as well makes the most sense. But that is my idea on the ninjas' ages throughout the course of the show, and like I said, let me know what you think and if you would change anything about it specifically. Is there a detail I missed? I don't think I did, but ultimately, if there is something, I would love for you to point it out to me. But like I said, let me know what you think, and thank you very much for watching. Take care, guys. Okay, bye!